Okay, so third lecture of our second unit, right? Du Fu, right? A life in poetry. We're going to flip through, take a couple specific examples that I think are indicative of both major phases of Du Fu's writing and major themes, but also I think just particularly stand out as interesting in greater context that we've had. Talk some general poetics, and then talk some finally like concerns that come with translation, right? Du Fu is known for writing in a couple forms, but he's most famously known for what is anglicized to Lu Shi, right? So 8 lines, 5 to 7 syllables, very strict pattern, right? Exposition in the first couplet. There's the theme gets unraveled over the next few couplets. Like the middle couplets, and then the last couplet is like a conclusion, right? This sort of strict when things happen should be very familiar after having talked about the haiku. It also shows up in a lot of traditional ideas in English for the sonnet, right? This many lines, this many syllables. By the time you get to lines 5 to 7, this should happen, right? Poems play with this space all the time, where the rule isn't just this is the rhyme scheme and this is the meter, but also when things thematically have to happen in the poem. Plenty of those show up in here. How distinctly the form necessarily translates 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Pretty well. We have a lot of these, especially in the later chunks, where we have many, many, many poems, and most of the poems are in couplets, right? Couplets show up in myriad cultures, right, but are very, very popular in the Chinese poetry of this time, in what comes before and what comes after, right? So definitely something distinctly of interest, right? I picked a couple specific examples that I think are interesting for us to talk about as benchmarks across the entire book, right? As you probably noticed, David Young split the book up into kind of like phases of his life, right? A life in poetry. It's a poetry memoir almost. He gives us some description of what's happening, and in this section about the early years, for example, right? There's a lot of his interaction with Li Bai, which we've already discussed is very important, right? I picked out one on page 19, which is just Li Bai and I visit the hermit fan, right? That's particularly interesting for a couple of reasons. Okay, these first, few couplets, I think, right, the exposition, right. Each of Li Bai's lines is very beautiful. Something like Yin Gang, a poet I've always loved. We have come visiting among these Dongming hills, and I declare I love Li Bai the way I would a brother. It's autumn. We get drunk and share a bed to sleep it off. Daily walks, sometimes holding hands. Looking for a place that has some peace and quiet. We've come to see our friend, the scholar of the suburb. As soon as we enter the gate, we're filled with admiration. The young attendant is so handsome and polite. And it keeps going. At sundown, we hear mallets pounding the laundry. Above this ancient city hang low banks of clouds. We sing our favorite song, Evergreen Citron's Great. Do government officers ever retire for love of vegetable soup? Let's lose all interest in matters of power and rank. Let's let our thoughts and feelings fly across distant oceans, right? So, this is like the most poemy poem that Du Fu can write. I love this, right? It does a lot of things that you will see all the way up to the immediate current contemporary writers in a myriad of cultures, including in English, right? Namely, this idea of there are contemporaries in their writing, and I love them for being people I know and being my friends, but also their influence and their work is so beautiful, and it does these things. And then the people who came before us and their work is so beautiful and means so much to me, right? We as writers, right, often do what I call like a hat tip to what's come before, right? There's a long-standing tradition in myriad cultures, and especially, via familiarity for myself in English language poetry, of just constantly referring to things that have come before, right? You pay proper homage to people who helped develop the shape of what the literature looks like, right? We mentioned Dufu, we mentioned Basho, we mentioned Neruda, right? There are things in here that remind me very distinctly of things Neruda is going to do later. He has an entire book of questions, and the instant I get to, do government officers ever retire for love of vegetable soup? You could tell me that's a translation of a Neruda line, and I'm in, right? It's infinitely funnier to me that it comes from Dufu, knowing his relationship with almost being a government officer, sort of kind of becoming a government officer, but also wanting to go out into to be the recluse who goes and meets with his other, literary intellectual friends and reads great poetry and enjoys nature and the beauty of its bounty, right? This idea at the end feels so very Taoist, which is why it's so it plays into things I mentioned before about when he's out with Li Bai and they're traveling and they're writing, right? He leans into that idea of like being this harmony and oneness with a greater picture of the natural, right? Fantastic poem, right? And I find it very, very interesting because it's from 1350 years ago and it's already doing that tradition, right? We are so innately drawn to the idea of praising or disparaging things that have had a prominent effect on us, but in this instance and most commonly praising those things that have shaped the path for us, that it makes you wonder if it's just an intrinsic feature of what the writing has to be, right, in any kind of culture. Super fascinating. We can also bump a little bit farther in to 45, which I believe is in the next section, which is during the rebellion, right? I picked this one out because it's very fascinatingly kind of the advent of his war poetry. And having personally spent a lot of time reading a lot of war poetry, I find it disconcerting to have not been exposed to this, right? It's interesting in the sense of how universal a lot of these ideas can be. All right. So if we read the poem, it's specifically a selection from a larger piece, right? So it's just 4 parts of a larger whole, right? It's from Serving at the Front, right, which was ostensibly the name of the actual collected larger piece. We pack and leave with heavy hearts, heading out to the frontier. The government's set a deadline. Deserters will be punished. The empire isn't big enough. Does it have to extend its boundaries? We march our way from our parents' love, shoulder our weapons, and swallow our tears. 2. There goes the village elder who rounds up the recruits. Here I am, packed up and heading for the front. Whether I live or die, I'm going into battle. Take it easy, officer, I'm doing as I'm told. Maybe out there on the road I'll meet a friend who can take back a letter to those at home. I doubt I'll see them anymore. We don't get to die together. 3. Trying out bows, we pick the taut ones. Choosing arrows, we pick the longest. Engaging with the enemy, we shoot their horses first. Capturing them, we try to begin with their leader. There have to be limits to killing. A country has to have boundaries. It's enough to repel an invasion. Why pile up the casualties? 4. The barbarians dared to assault our fort. The air was filled with dust for miles. We waved our swords around, and they collapsed and ran. We caught their famous chief and made him prisoner. We brought him to the headquarters, a rope around his neck. But this was just one victory. We must still serve our time. I find it fascinating, especially coming after the one directly before it, which has, for example, on page 43 has the line, some of us were first conscripted when we were just 15, sent north to guard the Yellow River. Now we're 40 and headed west. Back then, the village elders honored us. Now we come home with white hair, right? Both that one, which is the Song of the War Carts, and From Serving at the Front, right? They both deal with such similar themes that are very, very common in war poetry across the board, right? We can look all the way forward into the English canon with Wilfred Owen's Dulce et Decorum Est, right? Dulce decorum est pro patria mori is the old lie that he mentions at the end, which is it is good and honorable to die for your country, is a lie that's told by those in power to those who are fighting. Both of these have such intensely metaphysical meanings to them that inherently go back to what I think is at the core of Du Fu's writing, which is empathy. Right? There's so much emotion here. Right? There are times where I go through this book where I look at it and I'm like, damn, like I wish we had a stronger word here. Right? Like if someone wrote this poem in English, right, and submitted it to a workshop I was running, I'd be like, we can find a better word than sad. Right? But simple words have their purpose also in writing. But just sometimes I'm like, damn, this feels a little dry, right? But in the greater context of things, right? And that was more of an impression I had the first time I read the book. Then I went to learn about Du Fu and came back. It flourishes knowing who he was, right? And what was happening in the context of these things. There is such a distinct sadness in the Song of the War cards, for example, about the toll that war takes on those who fight it, right? But it's also echoed again in Serving at the Front, where he says, isn't the empire big enough? Does it have to expand its borders? And the idea that there has to be a limit to the killing. Like a country has to have boundaries, right? Very Taoist, Buddhist, and Confucian, right? But especially, this is perhaps where I start to get a little bit of contention with the idea that it is very distinctly becomes Confucianist. Does it, right? Like I think it does in the sense that it still dwells distinctly in the idea of national service, right? You're doing as you are meant to for your country, right? But I think these also give us ripe room to see the difficulty in translation here when we have something that's such a national cornerstone that can be politicized and turned into propaganda, right? So let's speculate, right? Let's take Serving at the Front and imagine that we're looking at it in its native language, right? If you were translating it from a modern, Communist Party of China perspective, right? Would you necessarily lean so much on the toll that it takes, right? Or would it be, would you maybe, through that philosophical lens, vaunt it as, look, like you're doing your part, right? Like that's the important part. What we take away from this poem is that, yes, it's a great sacrifice, but, as good members of the party, as good citizens, right, as good Confucians, right, we know we have to do what is asked of us. Our elders within the government have asked this of us, right? Now, if we look at it from what I feel like comes more distinctly from as it's written, right, but again, we're coming at it with a very modern and distinctly, in my case, for example, like Western lens look at it, right? And specifically a lens of having read a lot of war poetry, right? It's nearly a lament, right? We're doing these things, but like why, right? There's so much confusion and upset, and that last turn at the end, right, of this particular selection, right, where they're taking a man to hang, right? Ostensibly, right? They're marching him into camp as a prisoner with a rope around his neck. It's maybe a noose, or maybe he's just kind of being lassoed and brought in this way. But that idea that he's got the rope around his neck, they're going to hang him, right? And this is just one victory, and we must all serve our time, right? That last bit, I think, that last line, that last couplet rather, that concluding one that's so common in his form, is very indicative of where this poem is supposed to go, right? This idea that this end, right? Like, yes, there's a victory, but we all have a part to play. An end comes from all of us, for all of us, in some sense, right? We must all serve our time, right? Everyone will be. There's that reciprocity. Like, you're putting this violence out into the world. It's going to come back, right? And I think here Dufu meditates very strongly on, the fairness of it coming back to the people who are ordered to go do it. He lays it out for us that you go or you get executed or punished at least, right? Well, damn, we're supposed to go out and do this, and we already know from Confucius at the time that punishment is less motivating than a moral righteousness to it. So do we get around to the end where he describes them as the barbarians? And that's an interesting note of translation that I'd have for David Young. What other meanings for the word that he translates as barbarian could there be? Are they rebels, barbarians, soldiers, guerrillas? What other ways did you consider translating this? Because barbarian has a very distinct context, right? If we look at a Western concept of it, think of how the Romans talked about the Gauls and the barbarians, right? It's diminishing on the very least and derogatory at best, right? They are brutish and uncivilized, right? It makes me wonder for this poem, right? Is that what Dufu has come to view them as? Or is this an understanding of you start up right before it with there has to be a limit, right? So do we call them barbarians because they don't have a limit, right? Is that an implication that we can take? Or does Dufu's narrator here call them barbarians because this is the reciprocity, right? You've put violence out into the world and it's changed you, right? To the point where you don't see these necessarily as much as people, right? But there's that hint at the end, right, that we all must serve our time, right? That there's still a unification between them. There's still humanity there. There's still some empathy, right, or at least understanding of that Taoist and Confucian and Buddhist reciprocity, right? So I think it's very interesting, right? I take it as bemoaning the tragedy of the cost that war takes on those who fight it, right? Dufu spends a lot of time in this book, I'm sure you noticed, talking about how the war and the rebellion and then the subsequent retaking of the capital later on influenced people around him, not just him, right? As I said, war poetry is probably one of, if not maybe the oldest, if it's definitely in contention for literary traditions, right? Because just by nature, war has always, in some sense, been with us. Whether it's man versus nature or what we would conceptualize as war now, which is, one organized body of people versus another, one state or nation versus another state or nation, right? And very often in the war poetry, as it's come to be understood, and in our conceptions of it, it's often a thing that most scars the people forced to fight in it rather than those that order it, right? Even in the rebellion, the emperor leaves, right? He goes into exile for a while and then they come back, right? He doesn't die on the front like all these people will. He doesn't hang like this barbarian chief will, right? So it's interesting, right? To kind of consider, how do we think Dufu felt about it? And where we are historically, geographically, politically in any of those contexts, I think changes how it's read, right? Or how it can be used and put forward as a thing to be used. Those are all complicating factors in translation. Choosing that word barbarian, right? If I was the editor for this book, I'd be like, are you sure you want these to be barbarians? What do you mean by that? Do you not want to put in a footnote explaining exactly what word is using and why you think barbarian is the correct word, right? I'm not going to speculate on David Young's, political and philosophical leanings. I have no idea, right? But I find it interesting, right? Those are the specific sort of words that bring a lot of bite into them. Flipping that back to a comment I made before where I'm like, damn, I wish we had some more complex or interesting words at play in this. Well, barbarian's a cool word for a poem, but there's a lot to unpack here, right? What if it had just been the soldiers, okay, I'd probably read it and be like, all right, well, if it's a war poem, it's a pretty boring word. Cool, but it doesn't have weight and context to it. So why do we have the sort of less sanitized word here compared to some of the ones that otherwise show up in the book? I don't know, right? And it's something that makes me think a whole lot. I've fixated on this poem in this lecture enough, but just in general, I find it very fascinating. And it's something I want you guys to think about when you read these translations. The translator chose that particular interpretation, hoping to capture, in an ideal world, what they on the most scholarly level believe was the intention, or the best, closest analog in the receiving language from the host language to the literal and interpretive meaning of that thing, right? Obviously, we talked about Basho, about how with season words and things like that, literary symbolism doesn't directly parallel and it becomes more complicated, but why barbarians in this specific instance, right? That might be the most direct translation. Cool, right? So I'm curious why you'd go with the most direct translation, or is that direct translation colored by historical interpretations of this, historical evolution of the language, right? It's a series of complications, right? That a good translator and even a bad translator has to navigate, right? A good translator ideally is capturing as close as to what was at the heart at the time, and then letting us capturing as close to the original work as they can, and then letting us impose our interpretations from there as more modernized readers, right? But it's difficult, right? We have over a millennia of scholarly and linguistic development about this poetry sense. So I sympathize with David Young for trying to navigate it, right? Like, it's quite an undertaking. I'm impressed, right? But there are definitely times where I'd be like, why this word, right? And what does this mean? How does that change the tenor of the poem? Because, again, it changes the whole mood of the poem, I think, in that last series of 5 couplets by just including that word, right? So seemingly quick decisions made by a translator can have a profound effect on how we feel about things. But I think either way that we take barbarian have been implemented here, I think can add a particular level of still greatness to the poem. The poem is very successful, right? Which, in that it imposes and influences some sense of emotion and meaning, right? There is reciprocity that comes out of the work existing, which I believe Dufu would enjoy, right? The next one we're going to look at, it's on 62, right? I mentioned this before, but he likes to poke fun at himself. So I also mentioned that some people often would criticize him as being like selfish, where I think a more enlightened critical approach is that the point is showing how minor his things are compared to the horrors of the war around him and the complications and struggles of just good people living in the world around him. So on 62, we have, I finally get a post, right? Which is harkening back to his connections to the government. Just, oh good, I don't have to be a police commissioner at Hexie. It would have been backbreaking supervising all those beatings. I'm an old man. I can't rush around, bustle, and strut. But the job they've given me now at Palace Guard headquarters won't take too much time. It will pay for my wine and allow me to go on writing these crazy poems. So no more thoughts about retirement in the back hills of home. I turned my back on that and set my face to the wind. Right? He didn't want to have to be kind of that like direct influence on the extension of the government on the people around himself. He didn't want to have to extend that reciprocity out, right? He didn't want to have to do unto others as the government wanted done unto them, I think, which is fascinating. And now he gets to just be here and write and do an easy job, right? And it also, I think, kind of points to some of his criticism of where this is like where the bureaucracy really falls into this. Some maybe jaded ideas of how he feels about the system, but again, that's my own interpretation, right? Namely that like, oh, if I go out to the rural thing, I have to do the actual work of like essentially beating the populace into compliance, or I could just work in the capital, in the posh upper end of the government, doing essentially the same job as David Young notes in the footnote, right? And it's way easier and almost no work, right? So I'll just pick that one, right? Why is the capital job so much easier, right? Like, shouldn't, there's meritocracy here. Shouldn't the most exemplary people be doing the best and most work? Doesn't necessarily work out in the Confucian ideal, right? It's also kind of, I think, not necessarily bitter, but almost a sad note, right? Namely that he's come to accept that his chances of career aspirations in the government are gone. He's put them to bed, right? But also he has to give up that idea of just retreating out to the wilderness and living, that life that the rebellion and the ensuing turmoil has taken away from him, that he had gotten to taste and love when he was traveling with Levi, right? Another interesting note, there is a footnote here, right? Why not where there's one where we use barbarian, right? Interesting, right? This is and it's an interpretive one, which I think is fascinating, right? But doesn't break down what about, as it's translated, would have showed us that it was interpretive. It's more of a memoir interpretation note. So interesting choices, I think, in depending on what this project as a book was supposed to be. But I thought it was useful. And the last one I want to bring up, and we're not even getting super deep into his life, but I don't want to keep you all here for much longer than this, like half an hour. He writes in the next section more of the long poem, The Journey North, which huge parallels to Narrow Road to Oku. But I think here at the kind of end of this section, we start to see things that are going to be a good parallel to the structural things that Basho is going to pick up on, right? 500 words about my journey to Fengshan, right? It is a long selection. I'm not going to read all of it because I assume you guys can read it. It starts on page 63. But just imagine a man in commonplace clothes advancing years, impractical and even stupid, struggling on. He wanted to rank with sages. Instead, he has white hair and failure. Right? So keeping in mind things about his poetics, right, what the form looks like. I find it fascinating that we start his journey this way. Consider this man. And it's like, yeah, Dufu, like, I get it. You're talking about you and you're being disparaging, but like, how interesting! What a low point in how he feels about himself. It seems, and then the journey begins, right? And I think it's very fascinating, and the way that he goes through the journey and how things about it make him feel, and he plods along, reacting and witnessing things around him is something that Basho comes to really, really emulate. Okay, so. Dufu will come up in conversation again when we come back around later in the semester to the Kojiki, and I keep pointing over there because it's on my desk over there. However, we're going to bounce way forward in time and way across the world, literally just across the Pacific and in another hemisphere, to talk about a very distinctly different great. Namely, we're going to talk about Pablo Neruda, right? Now, I know you're going to slightly panic when you see the book. Here it is. It's humongous, right? However, you're going to see, after the first week, I'm going to give you particular selections, like read these chunks of the whole book, not the entire book. I'm not having you read like 600, 800 pages of Neruda. For a couple reasons. One, I'm not that cruel, and two, it's not all that good. So, it's the reality of it is, when you have an incredibly prolific writer, they're not all bangers, right? And Neruda has a whole bunch of just crap poems, and then just by volume almost, just a whole bunch of incredible ones, right? The reason we're talking about Neruda next, I did mention for Dufu that there are concerns that come into place into the interpretation of this work over time, right? Particularly in propagandist and political contexts of philosophy, right? Neruda gives us a different problem, right? In that he was very actively involved in making sure his writing served a very specific and incredibly problematic variety of politics, right? He sure did like his checks and medals from Stalin and thought fascism was pretty neat, right? Which is bad by any metric, right? However, he also has some of, if not undisputably the best poems written in that century by a great many people, and is often referred to as the greatest poet of his century, with a whole bunch of asterisks that often are left off when people talk about him, and are furthermore often left off in consideration of how we translate things, right? Or what we choose to translate. Why is it important to translate all of it? Is it important to translate all of it? Should we leave those problematic things in the realm of the footnote, or should we bring them to the fore to discuss what exactly is so gross about them? How does it tarnish the greatness of the rest? Should it? Should it not? Does it help that he's dead? Does it not? Right? Big questions, right? That I want us to unpack, and I thought it was interesting to hit on Neruda, and then we'll go on to another one who's very similar right after that. Coming off of starting to delve into that when we start to talk about how these things can be influenced by the political and the propagandist, right? Lens of things. So for next unit, get this Poetry of Pablo Neruda book. The specific ISBN is on the syllabus. Pick it up, and you're going to see go up for Monday the typical sort of, give me some background. I want you to unpack this. But it's going to be also tied very specifically to what are the major political events of his life, because they're directly relevant to what we're going to talk about. Okay. So we've gone from Japan to China over to Chile. We'll visit Japan again later down the line. My estimation is that we're going to go visit Turkey right after this, which should be fun, but is very much in conversation with these themes we've started to develop with Neruda and Dufu in lesser context before, right? You will also see your first major assignment go up over the course of the next week for a broader paper that you'll have a few weeks to work on as you're doing other things, right? So keep on top of the ball. I've loved reading what you guys have been writing. I'm doing a big old stack of grading this weekend for early alert purposes. But yeah, it's been a delight. I hope you enjoyed Dufu, even if it was just a glimpse into something you would not have gotten to see before, right? At the very least, I hope our conversation about him has raised some questions that you'll keep kind of churning in your mind as we go to other translations that perhaps are more familiar. Otherwise, you'll see my posts on the course website, and I'll see you guys in the lecture for next unit. All right. Thank you.